Hi, everyone. It's David Ault, and I want to welcome you to the gathering. It's the middle of January, and when I reflect back on my time as a minister, a spiritual leader, this was always the weekend that we would begin something called the Season for Peace and Nonviolence. It commemorates the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr., right here in the middle of January. And then it would go through the beginning of April, which would commemorate the birthday of Gandhi. These two examples of humans gave their life, their dedication, their devotion to bringing more peace into the world. They searched and devoted themselves to doing it in a way that was not typical. It had an element of non-violence, non-violent action. It was a way in which they were very involved in the evolution of peace, but it wasn't from a stance of warring. And I believe that that is revolutionary a lot of times in our thinking, because the misnomer is that when we see aggression, there is a reactive nature within us that wants to be aggressive back. Nonviolence, to welcome in peace through something that's psychologically called non-complementary behavior. I'm not going to meet the behavior at the same level. It's not going to be complementary. I'm going to bring something non-complementary to it in order to try and dissolve that particular systemic issue. And so I cannot help but think so much lately about violence. The different ranges of violence. And obviously a season for peace and nonviolence, really it should be all seasons. It should be constant. But that particular segment of time was a way in which for me and membership and people to pause and to take stock of our participation in the world and how we might be a beacon for peace. I want to talk about that today because I keep reflecting upon the way in which we are unconscious to our own violent nature. My beloved would go oftentimes and have these amazing one-on-one sessions with Ram Dass at the end of his life. And when he would go to Baba and he would talk about his life and his questions and struggles, he would oftentimes present and say, should I do this? Should I do that? And Baba would pause and reflect, and he would look at him, and oftentimes he would respond this way: too violent. Meaning that the way in which we think we need to fix and alter ourselves oftentimes has its own energy of violence to it. And so I want you to think about violence in its full spectrum. So right now, it appears as though the weather here in Atlanta is sort of violent because there's weather warnings and it's a massive winter storm. There is this volcanic eruption that just happened in the Pacific Ocean that is threatening the lives of the people of the island of Tonga. That feels violent. There is a hostage situation that is taking place in a synagogue in Texas. This is just happening in the U.S. There is violence like that going on day, hour by hour, day by day, all over the world. And so you see the nature of violence is something that is a part of the human experience. And yet if we are called to be a remedy for that, to be a light, to show an alternative way, some type of embodiment of non-complementary behavior, we don't have to do the same thing. Then don't we first have to start with the relationship of self? Just as Baba said to my partner, too violent. There are so many acts of violence that we put upon ourselves every single day. That's right. Acts of violence that we that we put upon, that we expose ourselves to, not by anything in the external world, but from our internal world of thought. And it's always fascinated me how we think that we can be an effective change agent in the world if we can't have our own peace and nonviolence towards ourselves. How do we do that? That to me is a form of insanity. And so I thought, how do I explain this? So consider that you and I, if we're going to bake something, we have a desired result about wanting to bake something, but we don't have the container to do that in. Are we going to throw the flour and the sugar and the oil and all of the other ingredients, the eggs, into an oven and expect it to produce that desired baked result? No, we've got to have the container. We can't just piecemeal these ideologies and little bits of band-aid for the violence in the world if we, the container, can't walk into the situation in order to be a part of the desired result. That's crazy. It's a waste of our energy. And this morning I want to find a way to remind ourselves of the importance, the inevitable value of doing our own work towards ourselves. So can you consider today that you are violent toward yourself? Violent in the way that you continue to think that you're not enough. Violent in the way in which we self-condemn a lot of times with regards to our physicality, our abilities, our smarts, our productivity. So many times we think we are our productivity. That's a form of violence. And so I want to usher in a new season for peace and nonviolence that isn't so much self-directed on how we're going to fix the world, but how we're going to reunite us with our essential self, right? How we're going to bake something intentionally and begin to prepare our maximization of being this change agent and this light in a world that has violence every single day. Let's bring meaning to this. Let's be the example of a Martin Luther King Jr. and a Gandhi and so many other light bearers in the world that have shown us its possibility. So one of the ways is to think about the nature of what I was writing down this week called the great put upon. How many of us feel put upon by organizations and by other people? They're not noticing me. They're not revering me. They're not behaving the way that I want them to behave. It creates this energy of being put upon. And in this energy of being put upon, then I can vocalize over and over and over again about all the things that I'm doing. All the things that I'm being, a good person, a devoted, helpful person, but the rest of you are not contributing. And that just kind of feeds into an internal violence, because it is violent to think that anyone is responsible for my happiness. I was jotting a thing down and I wrote the degree that you and I are willing to free others from the responsibility of our happiness is the degree that this freedom and the energy of nonviolence can be a tangible example that is offered to the world to embody. When I free others from being responsible for my happiness. Wow. Have you ever equated that to being a path of nonviolence? Have you ever considered that making someone responsible for your happiness is an act of violence? Have you ever thought about it that way? Because energetically, is it any different? Isn't that one of the ways in which Baba Ram Dass was saying to my partner, too violent, because so many of those things is laced in this forgetfulness of our enoughness. It's just go back to the love. Go back to the awareness that what we are is whole, complete, and perfect in that essential self. And so, what is going on then when we are holding someone else responsible for our happiness? What is going on when we are seduced all the time in wanting to fix people? And so, that again, can you imagine wanting to fix people as a form of violence? So I'm trying to break it down here in ways that we can begin to work on this. I think number one is participation, the way in which we are participating with people. Oftentimes what I find is there will be someone who will come to me in a moment of crisis, and they will want my help or they will want my advice, and I might give it to them. But what I also witness is that they have an inability to reciprocate. So in other words, if I'm experiencing something that feels a little bit crisis, they don't have the same capacity to be able to bear witness with me or to be there with me. They come to me when they need something, but I cannot go to them, or they are not available in that same way. And I start to think about them in a particular way, and I hold them in a state of grudge, and I look at them and I sort of give them some of my power, rather than going, that's just the nature of reciprocity, meaning that when I give something to, let's say, an entity or an individual, it will be given back, but it might not necessarily come from this particular person or this particular entity, because reciprocity is not confined to just one avenue of transaction. So can I, when somebody comes and wants something, can I just freely give it to them and then not hold them hostage to be that channel for that reciprocity? In other words, can I just give and let it go without attachment? But what I notice is in the energy of the great put upon is now I'm collecting evidence and I'm creating a narrative that says, I'm the one who always gives and you never give back to me. That's because I have siloed this particular transaction rather than being open to the infinitude by which the world will give it back to me. That's a form of suffering. And that suffering is a form of violence, because now I am locking these people into a certain way. And I am thinking violence with regards to the thought, because I'm making someone else responsible for my happiness. Freely give. It isn't give with expectation. It's called freely give. Can you do that? That's one way to begin to create a very conscious season for peace and nonviolence for yourself. Stop giving to get. Just give or don't give. Meaning, don't participate if you know that you are locked into that particular transaction. And people will argue all the time about this, and they will say, but I'm married to that. Or I'm in the same household as that. It's not that easy. You're right. A pattern of that transactional, egoic way of living is not easy to drop when it is so habituated. But nothing will ever begin to be dismantled. Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi did not get where they were immediately. It was a lifetime of devotion. And before you begin to think about that's not possible for you, that is also a form of violence, because you are forgetting your divine nature. Do you see where we're going with this? Violence and nonviolence is nothing more than a thought. When we think about the origin of that, people who reach particular levels of violent expression, they didn't just wake up and do that. That is a cultivation over time of indoctrination of thought. And we do the same thing. And so we also understand, too, rhythm. That when people are in sort of crisis thinking, it's a particular point in their rhythm of evolution. And a lot of times our rhythms do not match other people's rhythms. There is clarity that we have about a certain thing where someone else is in the rhythm of crisis in that particular thing. And at one time we were there. So you have to look and see that everybody is in their stage and their rhythm of evolution. How would we command and demand someone to be conscious about something that they have no understanding of? Again, you start to see what true freedom is. And it's not locking anybody else into the responsibility of my own internal world. That is huge. And so we look at participation, we look at rhythm, and then lastly, we look at the idea of release. Releasing others from being the fulfillment of our own warehouse or supply chain of our good. Because they're not it. I'm going to guess that you've heard this before. I'm going to guess that all of us who are on some type of conscious path understand this, but I don't know oftentimes if we realize how many times during any given day we are still holding these other people in this place of kind of hostageness, or a place of being held hostage, right? We have such human condemnation for what happened in this synagogue in Texas. But a lot of times we never consider the fact that we are holding other people hostage. What a sobering thing to think about. And so as we look at our own willingness to do that, can we begin to take pen and paper and start to write down everyone that we are holding hostage, everyone that we have a grievance against, everyone that we have placed outside of our heart? Make a list. And what must be done in order for you to free them? What must be done to bring peace into that situation? What must be done to reduce the internal thought systems of violence that is directed towards that individual? You and I may think at times that that's not enough. But let me remind you that nothing in the external world can change if we do not first do our own internal work. Begin to notice your feelings of being put upon. I have been so guilty of that throughout my life. In leadership, I'm the one that's doing everything. That's a part of the great put upon. That's again holding other people hostage for my peace and happiness. It's all interwoven into my habits of thoughts and beliefs about not being enough or overcompensating. It's all woven into the energy of violence. And there's never been a better time, and there will never be a better time for you and I to be the embodiment of peace in a way that we've never thought about before. I hope today is that day. I hope that in your meditative state, your time, your practice, that you will begin to think about this, and that a new form of advocacy will be begun. Peace. Peace to us all. And so it is.